Orleans was everything I expected and more. Vibrant, alive, but with an undercurrent of mystery that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The streets were lit up with neon signs from jazz bars, and the smell of spices and rain lingered in the air. This wasn't my first visit to the city, but it was the first time I'd come here alone. I was on a photography project, capturing urban landmarks at night. For someone like me who's always preferred shadows to sunlight, it felt like the perfect gig. I checked into a small boutique hotel in the French Quarter. The place had charm, high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and antique furniture that looked like it had seen more than its share of stories. The concierge, a middle-aged woman with a warm but tired smile, handed me the keys and warned me about wandering too far at night. "Some places in this city aren't as friendly as they seem," she said. I chuckled and thanked her, assuming it was just a local trying to add a little mystique to the experience. After dropping off my bags, I grabbed my camera and headed out. The plan was simple: shoot the Crescent City Connection Bridge under the moonlight. The iconic structure stretched over the Mississippi River like a giant's spine, and I wanted to capture its reflection in the water before the city's noise faded completely. The streets were quieter than I expected. Tourists had retreated to their hotels or bars, and the occasional car hummed by. The further I walked toward the bridge, the more isolated it felt. By the time I reached the foot of the structure, I was completely alone, save for the sound of water lapping against the shore and the distant hum of the city behind me. I'd been on the bridge for maybe 15 minutes, adjusting my tripod and snapping shots, when I noticed her. At first, she was just a shadow in the distance, leaning casually against the railing. She was dressed in a tight black dress that shimmered under the streetlights, her blonde hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. The way she stood there, perfectly still, gave me a weird feeling. It was like she was waiting for someone or something. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her eyes were on me. Finally, she moved, sauntering over in her heels like she owned the place. "Hey there," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Hi," I replied, forcing a polite smile. I kept my camera in front of me, pretending to adjust settings. "You're out here all alone?" she asked, tilting her head. Her smile was friendly, but her eyes felt sharp, like they were dissecting me. "Just taking some photos," I said, trying to keep the conversation short. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the pavement, and that's when I caught the faint smell of perfume. Overwhelming, like she'd bathed in it. "You're not from here, are you?" she asked. "Let me guess. Photographer, right? I could be your muse." She laughed, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "I appreciate it, but I'm good," I said, taking a step back. The rejection didn't sit well with her. Her smile faltered, replaced by a look I can only describe as cold. "You sure about that?" she said, her tone sharper now. "Guys like you always say no at first." I felt my pulse quicken. Something about her wasn't right. "Look, I'm not interested," I said firmly, slinging my camera bag over my shoulder. That's when her demeanor shifted entirely. Her smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure malice. "You think you can just walk away from me?" she hissed. And before I could react, she reached into her purse and pulled out a knife. For a second, I froze. The glint of the blade under the streetlight snapped me out of it, and instinct took over. I turned and bolted, my sneakers slamming against the pavement. Behind me, I heard her heels clicking like rapid gunfire, and her voice followed, sharp and manic. "You can't run forever," she yelled, her words cutting through the night air. I glanced back, and what I saw didn't make sense. She wasn't just chasing me, she was sprinting, fast, too fast for someone in heels. Her movements were unnatural, jerky but somehow fluid, like a predator closing in on its prey. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't dare slow down. The bridge stretched on endlessly, and the empty expanse made my footsteps and her relentless pursuit echo louder. I dodged to the side, trying to put distance between us, but she was gaining. I veered toward a maintenance stairwell that led down to the riverbank, nearly tripping over myself as I scrambled down the metal steps. The air down here was damp and thick with the smell of the Mississippi. I ducked behind a large concrete support pillar, trying to catch my breath. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could barely keep my hands steady as I clutched my camera bag like it might somehow protect me. Above me, her footsteps slowed. She was on the landing, pacing. "You think you're smart, don't you?" she said, her voice echoing in the hollow space beneath the bridge. "I know every inch of this place. You're just making it harder on yourself." I didn't move. I barely breathed. From my hiding spot, I could see her shadow stretching across the wall, distorted and monstrous under the flickering light. It was then I noticed something strange. Her shadow didn't match her movements. While she stood still, her shadow twitched and writhed, almost like it was alive. My stomach churned. This wasn't just some random psycho with a knife. There was something deeply wrong about her. I stayed as still as I could, hoping she'd give up and leave. But she didn't. Instead, I heard her laugh, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "I know you're down there," she said. "You can't hide from me. No one ever does." Panic gripped me. I needed to get out of there, but the only way back was up the stairs, right into her path. Then I spotted it, a narrow gap in the concrete wall, just big enough for me to squeeze through. It looked like it led to a drainage tunnel. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only shot. I slung my camera bag over my back, dropped to the ground, and crawled through the gap. The smell hit me immediately, stale water and decay, but I pushed forward, hoping the darkness would swallow me before she noticed. Her voice grew louder, closer. "You think you can hide in the dark? That's where I thrive," she said, her words dripping with malice. I crawled faster, the tunnel's cold, slimy walls pressing against my shoulders. The sound of her heels clanged against the metal stairs as she descended. My heart sank. She was coming after me. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, dimly lit by a single grate above. I scrambled to my feet, scanning for an exit. That's when I saw her silhouette at the other end of the tunnel. She wasn't holding a knife anymore. Her hands were empty, but they hung unnaturally at her sides, twitching. "You should have just said yes," she said, her voice echoing off the walls. Her face emerged from the shadows, and for the first time I saw her clearly. Her eyes weren't normal. They were entirely black, and her mouth twisted into a grin that seemed far too wide for her face. I didn't think. I just ran, barreling toward a ladder that led up to the street above. My legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward. As I climbed, I felt the air grow colder, and her laughter rang out, sharp and shrill. I didn't dare look down. When I finally reached the surface, I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. The street was eerily quiet, the city lights flickering like nothing had happened. I turned to look back at the tunnel, but it was empty. No sign of her, no sign of anything. I sat on the pavement for what felt like an eternity, staring at the dark entrance of the tunnel. My body trembled, and my breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just sleep-deprived, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something. My camera bag. The front pocket, which I never left unzipped, was wide open, and my camera was gone. A surge of panic hit me. That camera wasn't just expensive. It held all the photos I'd taken that night. The proof that I had been on the bridge. The proof that I wasn't crazy. Despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I found myself inching back toward the tunnel. I needed that camera. It felt like the only tether I had to reality. As I approached, the air grew colder, and the familiar scent of decay wafted up from the darkness. My heart thudded in my chest as I stepped inside. The tunnel was silent, save for the faint dripping of water. I turned on my phone's flashlight, the beam barely cutting through the oppressive blackness. Every step echoed, magnified by the confined space, and my pulse quickened with each one. Then I saw it, my camera, lying on the ground just a few feet ahead. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I bent down to pick it up, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the tunnel. "You came back," her voice said, reverberating off the walls. "I knew you would." I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but she wasn't there. Instead, her shadow danced along the walls, twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Her laugh grew louder, and then she stepped into the light. Her movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings, and her black eyes locked onto mine. "You can't run from me," she said. "Not anymore." I stumbled back, clutching the camera like it was some kind of shield. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. She tilted her head, her grin widening. "I want what they all want," she said. "To be remembered." Her words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just about me. It was about all the others who had come before, the ones who hadn't made it out. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a person. I was dealing with something far older, something that thrived on fear and suffering. I didn't wait for her to make the first move. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted through the tunnel. Her laughter followed me, growing louder and more distorted, like it was coming from everywhere at once. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows reaching out to grab me. When I finally burst out of the tunnel and into the open air, I didn't stop running. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from her. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I pushed forward until I found myself on a busy street. The sight of people, actual people, was like a lifeline. I collapsed on the curb, my camera still clutched tightly in my hands. I wanted to tell someone what had happened, but what could I say? That I was chased by a woman with black eyes and a shadow that didn't follow the rules? They'd think I was insane. When I got back to my hotel, I locked the door and didn't sleep a second that night. Instead, I went through the photos on my camera. Most were exactly what I expected. Shots of the bridge, the river, the lights. But then I found one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me, taken from the bridge. I was standing at my tripod, completely unaware, and in the background there she was. Her black eyes stared directly into the lens, her grin wide and menacing. I deleted the photo immediately, but it didn't matter. The image was burned into my mind. Weeks later, I left New Orleans and never looked back. But the experience stayed with me, haunting my dreams and making me question every shadow I saw. Even now, I can still hear her voice sometimes, faint and distant, like she's waiting for me to come back. And maybe someday I will, but not by choice. The message popped up on my phone late at night, just as I was about to call it a day. It was from a couple, Charles and Vanessa, who wanted to book me for an evening in their East Village penthouse. The payment they offered was enough to cover my rent for 3 months, and while it sounded too good to be true, I told myself I couldn't afford to turn it down. The doorman at their building greeted me like I was expected. The ride up the elevator was eerily silent, and when the doors slid open to the top floor, Charles was already there, smiling like he owned the world, which, judging by the opulence of the apartment, he probably did. Vanessa stood behind him, her posture stiff and her smile thin. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The place was massive, high ceilings, sleek furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. But something felt off. The air was cold, almost sterile, and despite the luxury, there was an emptiness to it, like the soul of the home was missing. Charles poured us wine, the expensive kind that I'd only seen in movies. Vanessa barely touched hers, instead watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it pity? Fear? I couldn't tell. Charles, on the other hand, was all charm and charisma, keeping the conversation light but steering it just enough to feel like he was sizing me up. Dinner was extravagant, the kind of meal you'd expect in a Michelin-starred restaurant, but I barely tasted it. The unease was growing with every passing minute. Charles dominated the conversation, his questions growing more invasive, while Vanessa sat quietly, occasionally casting nervous glances his way. After dessert, Charles leaned back in his chair and smiled. "How about we play a little game?" he said. Vanessa's eyes widened. "Charles, maybe we should just—" "It'll be fun," he interrupted, his tone light but firm. He turned to me. "It's just a way to get to know each other better." The game was a twisted version of truth or dare, but with no dares, only truths. If you didn't answer, you had to drink a shot of something he claimed was an imported spirit. The questions started off harmless, but soon took a darker turn. "What's the worst thing you've ever done for money?" he asked, leaning forward, his eyes glinting with curiosity. I hesitated, then gave a vague answer about lying to an ex-boss. He smirked, clearly unsatisfied, but didn't press further. Vanessa, however, seemed on the verge of tears. "What about you, Vanessa?" he said, his voice soft but sharp. "What's the one thing you regret the most?" She froze, her hand trembling as she set down her glass. I regret letting things go this far." Charles' expression darkened, and for a moment I thought he was going to hit her. But instead he laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a chill down my spine. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed a door slightly ajar. Through the gap, I saw what looked like a study, but something about the room drew me in. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with old, leather-bound tomes. In the center of the room was a desk, and above it a large mirror tilted downward. The angle made my reflection look wrong, distorted in a way I couldn't explain. On the desk, there was an open notebook filled with strange symbols and diagrams. Before I could examine it further, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I jumped and spun around to find Charles standing there, his smile now more predatory than friendly. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked, his voice dripping with faux politeness. I stammered an excuse, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped past me and closed the door. Locking it with a key, he slipped into his pocket. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had shifted. The furniture had been moved to the edges of the room, revealing a large rug with intricate patterns that I hadn't noticed before. At first, I thought it was just a design, but as I looked closer, I realized it was a symbol, a pentagram. "Vanessa, help me set up," Charles said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She hesitated, then began lighting candles around the edges of the room. My pulse quickened as I watched them. This wasn't some quirky game or a rich couple's eccentric hobby. This was something darker. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Charles grinned, holding up a knife with a gleaming, curved blade. "We're about to make history." Vanessa's hands shook as she placed the last candle. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time she whispered, "Run." I bolted for the door, but it was locked. Charles laughed behind me, the sound echoing in the room. "You think it's that easy?" I turned to face him, my back against the door. The knife in his hand gleamed in the candlelight, and his expression was one of twisted delight. "You're part of something bigger now," he said. "A sacrifice to bind power to us forever." Vanessa stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. "Charles, please," she whispered. "We don't have to do this." He snapped his head toward her, his smile vanishing. "Don't you dare back out now." Taking advantage of his distraction, I grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and swung it with all my strength. It hit him square in the face, and he stumbled back, dropping the knife. "Vanessa, the key!" I shouted. Vanessa hesitated, then ran to the study where I'd seen him pocket the key earlier. Charles, blood streaming from his nose, roared in fury and lunged at me. I dodged, grabbing a chair to keep between us. "Vanessa, hurry!" I screamed. She returned with the key, fumbling with the lock as Charles closed the distance between us. Just as he reached me, the door flew open, and I shoved him back with the chair. Vanessa and I dashed out, slamming the door behind us. But it wasn't over. As we ran down the hallway, Charles's laughter echoed behind us. "You can't escape. You'll never be free." We made it to the street, gasping for air. I turned to Vanessa, ready to scream at her for what she'd put me through, but she looked so broken that I couldn't bring myself to do it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I thought I could stop him." The sound of sirens broke through the night, and I realized someone must have called the police. When they arrived, we told them everything. But by the time they searched the apartment, Charles was gone. The symbols, the candles, the knife, everything had vanished, leaving no evidence of what had happened. A few weeks later, I got a call from Vanessa. She sounded different, calmer, but not in a good way. "He found me," she said, her voice hollow. "It's not over." Before I could respond, the line went dead. Now, every time I see a mirror, I check for something lurking just out of sight. I don't know if it's him or something worse, but I do know one thing. The shadows Charles conjured that night didn't disappear. They're still out there, waiting. I swear most of my clients are just average guys. You know, polite, straightforward, and they move on with their lives after our appointments. That's how I've managed to keep this job for years. Clear boundaries, no drama. Then Adam came along. He wasn't my usual client. Dressed sharp with that Wall Street vibe, he seemed polished and confident, but not in an arrogant way. He'd booked me for a dinner date. Nothing unusual, except he kept asking little personal questions like where I grew up or if I'd ever thought of doing something else with my life. I kept it professional, dodging anything too revealing. Adam booked me again the following week, and then again the week after that. He wasn't pushy or inappropriate, but there was something about the way he looked at me, like he was trying to figure me out. I ignored it. A lot of clients mistake kindness for connection, but they usually snap out of it. Then one night as we were wrapping up, he said something that stuck with me. "You deserve so much more than this, Rachel. A woman like you shouldn't have to share her time with anyone else." It was flattering, but also unsettling. I laughed it off, saying, "Well, that's not really up to you, is it?" But his smile didn't reach his eyes. It was like he didn't think I got the joke. It was a Saturday morning, my favorite time to recharge. I grabbed my usual coffee from this small shop near Central Park, a spot no one from work knew about. Or so I thought. As I stood in line scrolling through my phone, I heard someone say my name. My stomach dropped when I saw Adam standing there with that same polished suit and a cup of coffee. "Rachel, what are the odds?" he said, grinning. I forced a smile, trying to hide my discomfort. "Hey, Adam. Small world." He acted like it was some crazy coincidence, but something about the way he spoke felt rehearsed. He started asking about my weekend plans, and I kept my answers vague, hoping he'd take the hint. Over the next week, his texts became different. Instead of sticking to scheduling, he started asking how my day was, if I'd eaten, or what I was up to. I tried to steer the conversations back to work, but he ignored it. One night, after dinner with a friend, I got home late. As I walked up to my building, I spotted someone standing under the street lamp across the street. It was Adam. He didn't wave or call out, just stood there watching. I turned and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My hand shook as I checked my messages. Sure enough, there was a text from him. "You looked beautiful tonight." I didn't respond. Something told me this was more than just a harmless crush. After that night, things escalated fast. I started noticing Adam in places he had no business being. My gym. He was there, casually lifting weights and waving like we were old friends. My favorite grocery store. He'd pop up in the produce aisle, acting surprised to see me. At first, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe he just lived nearby. But then he started leaving things outside my door. A bouquet of roses one day, a box of chocolates the next. The worst was the handwritten notes. "Thinking of you always. You're the only one who understands me. I could take care of you if you let me." My stomach churned every time I found one. I blocked his number, hoping it would send a message. Instead, it made things worse. One evening, I came home to find a small package waiting for me. Inside was an old locket. It looked antique, the kind of thing you'd find in a thrift shop. I didn't even want to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened it, my heart stopped. Inside was a tiny photo of me. It wasn't one I'd given him. It was taken outside my building where I usually stood waiting for an Uber. I barely slept that night, every creak and shadow feeling like a threat. When I woke up the next morning, I noticed something else. My door wasn't fully closed. I was sure I'd locked it, sure of it. I went straight to the police. It felt like the logical thing to do. But as I sat in the small, brightly lit station explaining everything to the officer, his expression didn't exactly scream urgency. "You said he hasn't physically hurt you, correct?" he asked, flipping through the notes he'd scribbled on a yellow pad. "Not yet," I replied, "but he's following me, leaving things at my apartment. He even got into my building." The officer sighed. "Look, unless he's made direct threats or committed a crime, there's not much we can do. You could file a restraining order, but it takes time and enforcement can be tricky." Time. That's exactly what I didn't have. I left the station feeling defeated. Desperate, I called my friend Lisa. She worked nights as a bartender and was one of the few people I trusted with the truth about my job. Lisa didn't hesitate. "Pack a bag and come stay with me," she said. Her apartment felt like a safe haven, at least for a while. I stopped seeing Adam in my usual spots, and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd finally backed off. Then one night, Lisa came home late after her shift. Her face was pale as she held up a single red rose and a note she'd found on her car windshield. The note read, "You can't hide her from me." My stomach dropped. He knew where I was. Worse, he was watching Lisa too. We tore through her apartment that night, checking every lock, every closet, every dark corner. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It was like he was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lisa wasn't the kind of person to back down. "We're not living like this," she said, pacing her kitchen, while I sat at the table, feeling utterly drained. "We're going to handle this." Her plan was simple but risky. I'd go back to my apartment, knowing Adam would follow me. Lisa would stay nearby, ready to call the police if anything went wrong. The idea of going back there terrified me, but I knew we couldn't keep running. So the next night I returned home, leaving my lights off and curtains drawn. I sat on the couch in the dark, my heart pounding with every creak of the building. Hours passed. Nothing. For a moment I started to think maybe Adam wouldn't show up. Maybe I'd been wrong. Then I heard it. A faint creak. It was coming from my bedroom. I froze, my phone in my hand, ready to text Lisa. Slowly I crept down the hallway, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. When I pushed the door open, I almost screamed. Adam was sitting on my bed. He was holding one of my dresses, running his fingers over the fabric like it was the most natural thing in the world. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Rachel," he said softly, like we were old lovers reunited. "What are you doing here?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. "You didn't answer my messages," he replied, standing slowly. His expression shifted, dark and unhinged. "I thought we had something special. You can't just ignore me." I took a step back, fumbling with my phone. "You need to leave. Right now." "Leave?" He laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Rachel, I'm not going anywhere. You belong to me." That's when I hit send on the text to Lisa. Adam noticed and lunged toward me, but I dodged, running out of the room. I slammed the bedroom door behind me, grabbing a chair to wedge it shut. Seconds later, I heard pounding, his voice screaming, "You can't shut me out." The police arrived minutes later, though it felt like hours. Adam was arrested after a tense standoff, his screams echoing through the hallway as they dragged him away. After that night, I thought I'd finally feel safe again. But the truth is, the fear doesn't just disappear. Adam was charged with breaking and entering, harassment, and stalking. I moved to a new city under a new name, hoping to start fresh. But even here, miles away from New York, I find myself looking over my shoulder, checking every shadow for a face I never want to see again. I've learned to be more cautious, to guard my privacy like my life depends on it. Because it does. The worst part? A week after Adam's arrest, I got an anonymous text. "You can't hide forever." I'll never know if it was him or just a cruel coincidence, but one thing's for sure, some obsessions never really end. I grew up in Seattle, where the rain never seems to stop and the streets are alive even at night. Capitol Hill was my playground, a neighborhood that buzzed with energy, a mix of grungy dive bars, neon lights, and an undercurrent of danger that always made your heart race a little faster. I didn't belong there, not really. I was just a scrawny 17-year-old kid trying to fit in with people who seemed larger than life. Back then, I thought hanging around the wrong crowd made me tougher. They were older, louder, and always had something illegal in their pockets. Drugs were their currency, and I traded in my innocence just to be part of their world. It felt cool at first, sneaking into bars with fake IDs and laughing about it later, but deep down I knew I was in over my head. One Friday night after my so-called friends bailed on me, I ended up alone at this bar called the Crooked Lantern. It wasn't anything fancy. Dim lights, sticky floors, and a jukebox that played the same sad songs over and over. The kind of place where people went to disappear. That's when I saw him. He was sitting in a corner booth, this massive guy with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to pierce through the smoke-filled air. He was lighting up a cigarette, his hands as big as dinner plates. Something about him made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I couldn't look away. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to walk up to him. Maybe it was the way he sat there like he owned the room, or maybe I just wanted someone to talk to. Either way, I reached into my pocket, pulled out a cigarette, and offered it to him. He glanced at me, smirked, and took it without saying a word. "You want to step outside?" he asked, his voice gravelly, almost amused. The way he said it wasn't really a question. I should have known better, but I followed him anyway. The air outside was cold and damp, the kind that seeped into your bones. The guy led me into a narrow alley next to the bar, the walls covered in graffiti and the ground littered with broken glass. It smelled like rain and garbage, and the only light came from a flickering street lamp at the end of the alley. "So what's your deal, kid?" he asked, leaning against the wall. His tone was casual, but there was something off about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up. "I don't have a deal," I said, trying to sound confident. "Just killing time." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. "Killing time, huh? Funny choice of words." That's when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The usual hum of the city, cars, distant laughter, music was gone. It was just me and him in that alley, and suddenly the walls felt like they were closing in. "Hey man, I should probably head back inside," I said, taking a step back. But before I could turn around, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm. His grip was like a vice, and the look in his eyes turned from amused to something darker. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice colder than the night air. The moment he said those words, my chest tightened and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I looked up at him, his face twisted in a mix of anger and amusement, and for the first time, I realized just how much bigger he was than me. His grip on my arm was so strong it felt like my bones might snap. "What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled me further into the alley, away from the faint glow of the street lamp. My sneakers scraped against the wet pavement as I tried to resist, but he was too strong. Panic started to set in, my mind racing through every stupid decision that had led me to this moment. "Listen," I tried again, my voice shaking. "I don't have anything on me. No money, no phone, nothing worth your time." He finally stopped, turning to face me. The shadows made his expression even more menacing. "You think this is about money?" he said, his tone almost mocking. "You walked up to me. You put yourself in this situation." I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I thought we were just talking, man." "Talking?" He grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let me show you something, kid." Before I could react, he shoved me against the brick wall. My head hit the cold, damp surface and stars exploded in my vision. His hands were around my neck in an instant, squeezing the air out of me. My feet left the ground as he lifted me like I weighed nothing. I clawed at his hands, my nails scraping uselessly against his rough skin. The edges of my vision started to blur, and I could feel my body weakening. My mind screamed at me to fight back, but I was frozen, trapped in his iron grip. Just when I thought it was over, instinct kicked in. I twisted my head to the side and bit down on his arm as hard as I could. My teeth sank into his flesh, and he let out a guttural yell, his grip loosening just enough for me to drop to the ground. I hit the pavement hard, gasping for air, but I didn't have time to think. He was still clutching his arm, cursing under his breath, and I knew I had to run. I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward the end of the alley, my legs moving faster than they ever had in my life. "Get back here, you little shit," he roared, his voice echoing off the alley walls. I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept running. I could hear his heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer with each second. My mind was a blur of panic and adrenaline, every nerve in my body screaming at me to keep moving. As I turned the corner, I saw the faint glow of a convenience store up ahead. The sight of it was like a lifeline, and I pushed myself harder, my feet slipping on the wet pavement. The door jingled as I burst inside, startling the cashier. "Call the cops," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "He's trying to kill me." I turned around, expecting to see the man right behind me, but he wasn't there. The alley was empty, the darkness swallowing any trace of him. I stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath, while the cashier stared at me like I was crazy. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. I stood there in the middle of that convenience store, gasping for air, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The cashier, a skinny guy in his 20s, stared at me with wide eyes, frozen behind the counter. "You're bleeding," he finally said, pointing at my neck. I reached up and felt the sticky warmth of blood trickling from a small cut near my collarbone. It wasn't deep, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. "Call the cops," I repeated, trying to steady my voice. "There's a guy out there. He tried to kill me." The cashier fumbled for the phone, his hands shaking almost as much as mine. I turned back toward the entrance, expecting to see that man burst through the door at any second. But the street outside was empty, the neon lights casting eerie shadows on the wet pavement. The cops showed up about 10 minutes later, though it felt like hours. 2 officers stepped inside, their radios crackling, and started asking me questions. I told them everything, well, almost everything. I left out the part where I had approached the guy in the first place. I didn't want them thinking I was some idiot kid looking for trouble, even if that was exactly what I'd been. One of the officers, a woman with a sharp gaze, nodded as I talked. "You're lucky to be alive," she said when I finished. "Capitol Hill's not the safest place to wander around at night." "No kidding," I muttered, my voice barely audible. They offered to drive me home, and I didn't argue. Sitting in the back of the squad car, staring out at the rain-slick streets, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I was alive, sure, but something about the way that man had looked at me, like I was prey, stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of him. The next few days were a blur. I stayed home, barely sleeping, jumping at every little noise. My mom noticed something was off, but I brushed her concerns aside, blaming it on stress from school. I didn't tell her what had happened. I couldn't. But then strange things started happening. At first it was subtle, a shadow lingering at the edge of the street when I walked home from school. A figure standing too far away to make out clearly, but close enough to make me uneasy. I tried convincing myself it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me after what I'd been through. Then one night I heard footsteps outside my bedroom window. My room was on the 2nd floor, so it didn't make any sense, but the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps like someone pacing back and forth. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and stared at the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a shadow moving behind them. I wanted to scream, but the fear was paralyzing. Instead, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. As the operator answered, I heard something else, a low, guttural chuckle, so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. When the cops arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. One of the officers, the same sharp-eyed woman from before, pulled me aside. "Are you sure you're not just imagining things?" she asked, her tone not unkind but skeptical. "I'm not crazy," I snapped, my voice cracking. "He was here." She didn't argue, but I could tell she didn't believe me. That only made it worse. Because if the cops couldn't protect me, who could? The fear had become a part of me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every night I double-checked the locks on every door and window in the house, sometimes 3 or 4 times. But no matter how safe I tried to make myself feel, I knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. It was a Thursday night when it all came to a head. The house was quiet, too quiet. My mom had gone to bed early, and the only sound was the low hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I sat on the couch, staring at the TV, not really watching, just trying to keep myself distracted. But then I heard it, a noise that made my blood run cold, a knock at the front door. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor or delivery driver. It was slow, deliberate, each impact echoing through the silent house. I froze, my heart racing as I stared at the door, the shadows from the porch light shifting against it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just another knock. Slow, heavy. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a metal baseball bat leaning against the wall near the staircase, and crept toward the door. My hands were slick with sweat, my grip shaky as I peered through the peephole. The porch was empty, but as I backed away, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, nearly dropping the bat, and pulled it out. There was a text from an unknown number. "You can't hide forever." My stomach dropped. The number had no name, no history, just those 4 words glowing on the screen. I tried to call the cops, but before I could hit send, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and I felt the kind of terror that claws at your throat and makes it impossible to breathe. I could hear him then moving outside. His footsteps, slow and deliberate, circled the house. I backed into the kitchen, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sound of glass breaking shattered the silence, and I spun around just in time to see him climbing through the window. It was him, the man from the alley. His face was hidden by the shadows, but I'd never forget those eyes, cold and empty, like a predator sizing up its prey. "This time you don't get to run," he said, his voice low and full of malice. Adrenaline surged through me. I swung the bat as hard as I could, the sound of metal connecting with bone ringing out as I hit his arm. He stumbled back, letting out a pained grunt, but it only seemed to make him angrier. He lunged at me, grabbing the bat and yanking it from my hands. I didn't think, I just acted. Grabbing a knife from the counter, I slashed at him, the blade catching his shoulder. He screamed, stumbling backward and knocking over a chair. The sight of his blood should have made me feel stronger, but all it did was remind me how close I was to dying. Somehow I managed to run past him, bolting out the front door and into the street. I screamed for help, my voice echoing through the empty neighborhood. Lights flicked on in a few houses, and I could hear people shouting, but I didn't stop running until I saw the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car at the end of the block. The cops swarmed the house, but by the time they got inside, he was gone. They found blood and broken glass, signs of a struggle, but no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. In the weeks that followed, I moved to a different neighborhood, changed my phone number, and started therapy. I tried to piece my life back together, but the fear never really went away. I still check over my shoulder when I'm walking alone, still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. I never saw him again. But sometimes, late at night, I still get texts from unknown numbers, short cryptic messages that send a chill down my spine. "You can't hide forever." And I know deep down that he's still out there, watching, waiting. I was 25, broke and drowning in debt. Living in Las Vegas wasn't glamorous like people imagine. My apartment was a dump, my fridge was always empty, and my mailbox was crammed with overdue bills. But the worst part? The medical debt I'd taken on trying to save my mom before she passed. I worked as a waitress on the Strip, picking up double shifts and dealing with rude tourists, all for barely enough to scrape by. Every day felt like a losing battle. One night, after a particularly bad shift, I was scrolling through job listings on my phone when an ad caught my eye. High-paying opportunities for beautiful women, no experience required, flexible hours. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. It was sketchy, I knew that. But what other choice did I have? I'd been working myself into the ground for years and it still wasn't enough. Against my better judgment, I called the number. A man named Victor answered. His voice was smooth, confident, like he could sell ice to an Eskimo. He said he ran a discreet escort service for wealthy clients. The money was more than I could dream of making in a year, let alone a month. I didn't even need to do anything sexual if I didn't want to. He made that clear. A few days later, I met Victor in person. He was sharp-dressed, with slicked back hair and this magnetic charm that made me feel at ease. He explained how it worked. I'd meet clients, keep them company, and make a lot of money. I'd have control over who I saw and what I did. It sounded perfect, too perfect. But then came the contract. It was long, full of legal jargon I didn't understand, but Victor brushed it off, saying, "It's just standard stuff to protect both of us." I hesitated, but then I thought about the pile of bills waiting for me at home. I signed. At first, it seemed like I'd made the right decision. My first client was a tech entrepreneur in town for a convention. We had dinner at a fancy restaurant, and all I had to do was smile, laugh at his jokes, and pretend to be interested in blockchain. He handed me an envelope stuffed with cash at the end of the night, but things started getting strange after that. Victor asked for my phone, saying he'd replace it with one better suited for the job. The new phone was basic. No internet, no social media, just a list of numbers I was allowed to call. Then there were the rules. No talking to clients outside of appointments. No leaving town without permission. No asking questions about the business. "It's for your safety," Victor said with that same charming smile. I met other girls working for Victor, and they all seemed off. Mia, a petite blonde with a nervous laugh, warned me to be careful. "Victor's nice until he's not," she said quietly one night. Her words stayed with me. Things escalated when Victor started keeping my money. "It's for management," he explained. "I'll invest it for you." Every time I asked for a cut, he'd give me a fraction of what I'd earned. When I pushed back, his smile disappeared. One night, Mia vanished. Victor said she'd quit, but something about his tone didn't sit right. The other girls avoided the subject like it was taboo. That's when I started paying attention, and what I found terrified me. I couldn't stop thinking about Mia. She'd been scared, I knew that much, but she never seemed like the type to just disappear. One night after Victor sent me to meet a client at a hotel, I decided to do some digging. Victor's office was in a small strip mall downtown. I'd seen him go in and out with files and briefcases, always locking the door behind him. I'd also seen where he kept the spare key. One afternoon, while Victor was distracted on a phone call, I slipped into the office. My heart pounded as I rummaged through the drawers and cabinets. Most of it was boring, receipts, business cards, contracts, but then I found a locked drawer. Using a paperclip, I managed to jimmy it open. Inside were files, one for each girl. Photos, personal information, client lists. It was all there. I flipped through the files until I found Mia's. Her photo was crossed out and the word "missing" was scrawled across the top in red ink. My stomach dropped. I kept flipping and found other files marked the same way. Jessica, a girl I barely remembered meeting, was also listed as missing. There were 5 names in total. I grabbed as many files as I could carry and slipped out of the office. My hands were shaking as I stuffed them into my bag. I had proof now, but I didn't know what to do with it. That night I tried to call the police, but the burner phone Victor had given me wouldn't dial out. I was trapped. I couldn't stay. That much was clear. But leaving wasn't going to be easy. Victor had eyes everywhere, and he kept us on a tight leash. The only time I was ever alone was during client meetings, so I started planning my escape during one of those. Victor sent me to a rundown motel on the edge of town to meet a client. The place was disgusting. Peeling wallpaper, stained carpets, but it had something I could use. A back door. When the client arrived, I played along, pretending everything was fine. I laughed at his jokes, poured him a drink, and waited for the right moment. When he stepped out to use the bathroom, I grabbed my bag and bolted. The alley behind the motel was dark and narrow, but I didn't stop running. I could hear Victor's voice in my head, taunting me, telling me I'd never get away. When I reached the main road, I flagged down a car and begged the driver to take me to the nearest police station. They hesitated, but the desperation in my voice must have convinced them. At the station, I handed over the files. The officers looked skeptical at first, but as they flipped through the evidence, their expressions changed. Victor was arrested a week later. The police found more evidence in his office, enough to put him away for a long time. The other girls started coming forward, their stories as horrifying as mine. But even with Victor behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. One night I got a text on my new phone. "You think you're safe?" I moved to another city, changed my name, and started over. But I still sleep with the lights on, always looking over my shoulder. I escaped, but I'll never truly be free. The apartment was too quiet. Again. Nights like this were the worst, when the silence didn't feel peaceful but suffocating. My name's Ethan. I'm 35, divorced, and living alone in a modest apartment in Westwood, Los Angeles. Most nights I drown out the emptiness with Netflix or scrolling on my phone, but that night was different. I don't know why, but the silence felt louder, heavier. I needed a distraction. I poured myself a whiskey and slumped on the couch. The idea didn't hit me all at once. It crept in slowly like a guilty whisper in the back of my mind. Maybe it was the whiskey, maybe it was the loneliness. But before I knew it, I was typing companionship services into my laptop. The site I found looked surprisingly legitimate. It wasn't the kind of sketchy page you'd expect. This was sleek, professional. There were profiles with photos and bios. Nadia's picture stopped me. Dark hair, striking green eyes, and a smirk that seemed to dare you to look away. Her bio read, "Let me make your night unforgettable." I hesitated, my cursor hovering over the contact button. I'd never done this before, and I wasn't sure if I could go through with it. But loneliness is a persuasive bastard. I clicked. Her reply came fast. Too fast, maybe. "I can be there in an hour," she wrote, followed by a rate. It was high, but not so much that it felt outrageous. I gave her my address and downed the rest of my drink, trying to quiet the growing unease in my chest. An hour later, headlights swept across my window. My pulse quickened as I opened the door. She was even more stunning in person, but something about her felt off. Maybe it was the way her eyes darted around my apartment like she was taking inventory, or the faint smirk that didn't seem to leave her face. "You live alone?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Yeah, just me," I said, my voice tighter than I'd intended. She took off her jacket and draped it over a chair, revealing a thin silver chain around her neck. Her movements were graceful but calculated, like she was always a step ahead of me. The interaction itself wasn't anything special, but what stuck with me was her gaze. It wasn't flirtatious or inviting. It was assessing, like she was studying me. When it was over, I handed her the cash. She folded it neatly, slipped it into her purse, and then looked at me with a grin that made my skin crawl. "Not enough," she said. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "What do you mean?" "That's what we agreed on." She leaned back, her smile unfaltering. "I had to come all the way out here. I think I deserve a little more for my time." "No," I said, trying to sound firm. "We had a deal. That's all you're getting." Her smile twisted into something colder. "Take me to an ATM. I'm sure you've got more." My hands tightened into fists. "We're done here. You need to leave." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she stood, slung her purse over her shoulder, and walked to the door. But instead of leaving, she stopped on the porch, pulled out her phone, and started speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Russian, maybe. I peeked through the blinds, my heart pounding. She paced back and forth, gesturing angrily, her voice low but intense. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. Then I saw the headlights. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, its windows tinted so dark you couldn't see inside. 3 men stepped out. They were huge, built like linebackers, and their expressions were cold, almost mechanical. Nadia pointed toward my apartment. The first knock on my door was loud enough to make me jump. "Open up!" one of the men barked, his voice deep and menacing. "We need to talk!" Panic set in. I backed away from the door, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Another knock, harder this time. The door frame shook. "You don't want to make us come in." I dialed 911, my fingers trembling. As the dispatcher answered, the pounding on the door turned into kicks. "3 men are trying to break into my apartment," I whispered, trying not to let my voice carry. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. "Officers are on their way." The men weren't waiting. I heard them circling the building, their heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. One of them shouted, "We know you're in there. You think you can disrespect us and get away with it?" My breath hitched. What did they mean by disrespect? This wasn't about the money anymore. I stayed hidden in the kitchen, clutching a knife in one hand and the phone in the other. The dispatcher's voice was a dull hum in the background compared to the sound of the men trying to force their way inside. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I heard the SUV door slam. The engine roared to life, and tires squeal as it sped away. My legs felt like jelly as I approached the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but the empty street. When the police arrived, I told them everything. Nadia, the men, the threats. They looked skeptical, especially when I mentioned hiring an escort. One of them smirked, and I felt a flush of shame creep up my neck. "You probably scared them off by calling us," one officer said. "They won't be back." But I wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd hear faint knocking at odd hours, but when I checked, no one was there. My car alarm went off in the middle of the night, but nothing seemed tampered with. Then came the note. It was taped to my door, written in neat, blocky handwriting. "You don't walk away from us," it read. The words sent a chill down my spine. I packed a bag that night and drove to a motel across town. I couldn't sleep. Every noise felt like it was meant for me. Every shadow on the wall seemed alive. The next morning, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a woman's voice whispered, "Never forget." I moved out of Los Angeles a week later, but the paranoia followed me. Every black SUV I see makes my stomach drop. Every unknown number feels like a threat. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'll never forget Nadia's smile as she left my apartment that night. It wasn't just a smile, it was a promise.